If you believe that healing means becoming calmer, kinder, and easier to get along with, you need to know this now. Carl Jung discovered that true healing does exactly the opposite. She doesn't soften. She wakes, and when an empath truly awakens, something dangerous happens. Not for innocent people, but for anyone who has ever tried to use them, manipulate them, or drain their energy without being noticed. Jung realized this not from motivational books, but from the heavy silence of his consulting room. Extremely sensitive people didn't come to him because they were weak or unstable. They came because they were burdened with conscience. They felt too much, perceived too much, carried too much, and no one had ever explained that this was neither a virtue nor a flaw. It was a specific psychological condition. These people lived as if they were an emotional buffer for the world. They would enter a room, and before any words were spoken, they already knew who was lying, who was angry, who was about to explode inside, not because they imagined it, but because their bodies picked up signals that others ignored. Minimal changes in tone of voice, out-of-place pauses, contradictions between words and emotions. Jung called this unconscious participation. The person not only observes the other, he participates in his unconscious without realizing it. And here arises the empath's first internal conflict. If I feel all this, is it my responsibility to resolve it? With no one to guide them, they answer yes. They become the one who endures the most, the one who understands the most, the one who gives in the most, the one who absorbs the tension to maintain peace. And the more they do this, the further they distance themselves from themselves. Jung observed something unsettling in this pattern. While the empath dedicates themselves to carrying the suffering of others, they begin to lose touch with their own identity. Their boundaries disappear. Their desires become confused. Their choices are guided by the fear of disappointing, the fear of hurting, the fear of being rejected. Sensitivity, which should broaden awareness, begins to function as a silent prison, and nobody around notices. On the contrary, everyone praises him. They say he's strong, special, understanding, but inside something starts to get sick. A weariness arises that doesn't go away with rest, an irritation without apparent reason, a strange feeling of living other people's lives, while his own is suspended. In the background, Jung would ask these patients a simple question, and almost all of them would remain silent. Where do you end and the other person begin? Most people didn't know the answer, because she had never been allowed to exist separately. This is the point that few understand. Empaths are not born to be martyrs. They are born with an enhanced capacity for perception. The problem is that without awareness, this perception turns against them. They begin to confuse love with sacrifice, empathy with self-abandonment, understanding with tolerance of abuse. And then another uncomfortable question arises, one that Jung considered central. What happens when someone sees too much but cannot act upon what they see? The answer is simple and devastating. The person implodes from the inside. That's why many empaths reach their breaking point not in silence but through emotional collapses, anxiety attacks, or abrupt breakups. Not because they are unstable, but because they have endured a psychic burden that wasn't theirs for too long. They lived for years believing that feeling the pain of others was a sign of spiritual maturity, when in reality, it was a lack of integration. Jung made it clear. Healing doesn't begin when the empath learns to feel less. It begins when stop confusing yourself with the suffering of others. And this doesn't happen smoothly. The psyche doesn't reorganize itself with pretty phrases. It reorganizes itself when a fundamental illusion collapses. Almost always, this moment arrives as a rupture, a betrayal, a revelation, a shock so clear that it no longer allows for self-deception, something that forces the empath to confront an uncomfortable truth. I always knew. I just didn't want to trust what I saw. This is the moment when true healing approaches, not as immediate relief, but as an inner calling impossible to ignore. Jung knew that, after this point, consciousness does not return to its previous state. Perception ceases to be mere sensitivity and begins to demand a stance. And it is precisely here that everything changes. Because when the empath begins to trust what he perceives, he ceases to be merely someone who feels. He begins to become someone who sees. And this begins a process that Jung considered irreversible. But what happens after this shock? What awakens within the empath when they finally stop doubting themselves? And why did Jung say that this moment marks the birth of something far more powerful than empathy? That's what you'll understand next. The moment that changes everything rarely feels spiritual. It doesn't come with soft music or a sense of liberation. Most of the time, it arrives like a dry shock, a conversation that doesn't quite work, a revealing look, a detail too small to ignore, too big to explain. That's when the empath enters the point that Carl Jung described as irreversible, when consciousness sees something that can no longer be unseen. Almost always this happens within an ordinary relationship, a marriage, a long friendship, a family bond. Nothing extraordinary at first glance. Imagine someone who always trusted, always justified, always gave another chance. Someone who felt discomfort, but told themselves it was insecurity, exaggeration, an old trauma, until the day a piece out of place fits perfectly. A lie discovered by chance, a repeated behavior that finally makes sense, a smile that doesn't match the situation. At that moment, the empath notices something disturbing. He always knew. The body knew. The intuition knew. The physical reactions were there all the time. The tightness in the chest before conversations, the tiredness after meetings, the strange feeling of always having to explain oneself. But the mind spent years negotiating with this perception to keep the bond alive. Jung observed that this is the point at which the psyche stops cooperating with denial. The empath may even try to backtrack, pretend not to have noticed, but something internal has already changed. Blind trust breaks down, not in the other person, but in a much deeper idea, the idea that feeling too much means being wrong. From that point on, something curious happens. The empath begins to revisit the past with new eyes. Old conversations take on a new meaning. Situations that previously seemed confusing become organized like a complete puzzle. The betrayal was not an isolated event. It was merely the visible point of a pattern that had always been there. Jung said that at this stage, the unconscious delivers raw, unanesthetized material to consciousness, not to punish, but to reorganize. It's uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating. A difficult question arises. Why did I stay so long? Soon after comes another, even more painful one. What did I gain by being like this? This is the second major conflict for the empath, because at the same time as he sees the truth about the other, he begins to see something about himself. He realizes that he confused love with resistance, loyalty with self-abandonment, kindness with fear of loss. Jung didn't treat this as guilt, but as a lack of awareness. It wasn't weakness, it was unconsciousness. And here comes a silent turning point. The empath begins to trust what they perceive more than what they are told. Not in a paranoid way, but attentively. They start to notice patterns in daily life. People who always ask for help but never change. Conversations that always revolve around the other person's drama. Relationships in which they feel empty without knowing why. Think of something simple. A message that always arrives late at night, laden with problems. An urgent request that only appears when the other person needs it. A subtle hint of guilt thrown in as bait. Only you understand me. I can't do it without you. You've changed. Before this triggered compassion. Now it triggers awareness. Jung described this moment as the beginning of psychic separation. The empath begins to realize that not all pain requires acceptance. Some require boundaries. Some require distance. Some require silence. And this distinction generates discomfort because it breaks with the old identity, that of someone who has always been available. It's common for empaths at this stage to feel strange about themselves, more quiet, more observant, less willing to explain everything. They're not cold. They're reorganizing one's own psyche. It is moving from unconscious participation to conscious perception. But this process has a social cost. People start to react. Some find it strange. Others put pressure on them. You're not the same anymore. And they're right. Jung stated that no one crosses this point and remains the same. Consciousness demands a stance. The empath feels this in their body, a different kind of tension. It's not old anxiety, it's alertness. It's as if something inside is saying, now you know too much to pretend. And that's scary because knowing requires action, even if action means losing connections. This is where the real suspense of transformation begins. Because the empath doesn't yet know what they are becoming. They only know what they can no longer be. You can no longer absorb everything. You can no longer explain yourself all the time. You can no longer ignore what you see. Jung said that from that point on, the psyche begins to develop a new function, the ability to give back to the world what is not yours. But this doesn't happen all at once. First comes silence, then observation, then something unexpected. The empath begins to realize that by not reacting as before, something changes in others. People become uncomfortable. Some get irritated. Others try to provoke guilt. Others simply distance themselves. And this reveals something that was previously hidden: who approached for genuine exchange and who approached out of convenience. This is the moment when Jung would say that consciousness began to differentiate. But the empath doesn't yet know how to use this. He only feels that he has crossed an invisible line. And the question that remains is unsettling. What happens when someone who has always absorbed everything begins, without realizing it, to reflect? Because that's exactly what's about to happen. There is a curious moment that Jung observed repeatedly, and that is almost never clearly described. The empath doesn't change from the outside in. He changes in the invisible field of the relationship. Something subtle happens when he stops absorbing automatically. There is no discourse. There is no confrontation. There is only an unexpected absence, the absence of the old reaction. For years, the empath responded with immediate empathy. The pain of others entered, became an internal responsibility, and exited in the form of care, explanation, or forgiveness. This reflex was so automatic that no one understood how they depended on it. But when consciousness reorganizes itself, this reflex disappears, and the silence that arises in its place has more impact than any word. What few people understand is that empaths don't decide to change their behavior. They simply can no longer feign confusion. The perception became all too clear. The psyche no longer accepts carrying what does not belong to it. But what happens when you stop absorbing something that the other person has always poured into you? What emerges when the space previously occupied by reaction becomes an observant void? This is where the phenomenon that Jung described as interrupted projection begins. The other person speaks, accuses, dramatizes, provokes, and nothing happens on this side. Not because the empath is indifferent, but because they are no longer involved. The energy finds nowhere to attach itself. In everyday life, this manifests itself in simple and disconcerting ways. A person complains, expecting consolation, and receives only a neutral listening ear. A passive-aggressive comment is made, expecting blame, and meets with silence. A provocation arises, expecting defense, and returns without echo. The dynamic fails, and when the dynamic fails, something profound is revealed. Those who related through genuine exchange grow even closer. Those who related through emotional release begin to feel exposed. Jung said that the unconscious cannot bear to be seen without anesthesia, and the integrated empath, without realizing it, begins to illuminate the unconscious of others simply by being present. Have you ever noticed how some people get restless when you don't react the way you used to? Why does discomfort arise precisely when you stop explaining yourself? This is the point where the empath stops being a sponge and becomes a mirror. Not a moralistic mirror, but a psychological one. The other person begins to hear their own voice, to feel their own emotion, to deal with their own burden. And that is unbearable for someone who has always outsourced emotional responsibility. Jung observed that manipulators don't fear confrontation. They fear stable consciousness, because manipulation relies on confusion, doubt, and reactivity. When those doors close, the game is over. Not with an explosion, but with embarrassment. That's why the attack usually comes right after. The empath is called cold, selfish, distant, different. Not because their character has changed, but because they've stepped out of the unconscious role that sustained the system. The accusation is a desperate attempt to restore the old dynamic. But something curious happens internally in the empath at this stage. They no longer feel the need to prove anything. They don't feel an urgency to be understood. A silent clarity emerges. I know what I saw. And this certainty is not arrogance, it is calmness. What happens when you no longer need to convince anyone of your reality? Who loses power when you stop doubting what you perceive? Jung called this a strengthening of the inner axis. The person begins to be guided more by their own perception than by external reactions. There is no emotional isolation. There is psychic centralization. The empath continues to feel, but now feels from within themselves, not from the other person. This change creates a chain reaction. Conversations become shorter. Dramas lose intensity. Some people simply disappear. Others try to intensify their behavior, as if turning up the volume to see if anything still resonates. But it doesn't. And that's where a new and little discussed fact emerges. The empath begins to perceive patterns before that manifest themselves fully. Small signs gain immediate significance, not as suspicion, but as recognition. Jung described this as differentiated perception, the ability to see the whole from minimal fragments. A recurring delay, a slight contradiction, a request that always comes with emotional urgency. Before, this was ignored in the name of empathy. Now it is recorded, not with judgment, but with clarity. Do you realize how this changes everything? What remains when empathy ceases to be automatic and becomes conscious? The empath begins to notice something uncomfortable. Many relationships only existed because they supported the confusion. Without the expected response, these relationships no longer have anywhere to turn to. And this isn't cruelty, it's reality. At this stage, the empath is not yet actively using this perception. They are merely observing. They are still learning to trust their own perspective without guilt. But one thing has already become clear. He is no longer susceptible to unconscious games. And this creates a silent tension in the atmosphere. People sense that something has changed, but they can't explain it. They just feel they can no longer enter as before. That something is closed off, not out of defense, but out of clarity. Jung said that this is a point of no return, because once the psyche experiences internal stability, it no longer accepts chaos as normal. The empath begins to protect something they had never protected before, their own clarity. But this clarity still needs form. It still needs direction, because seeing is not the same as choosing. And the next stage is no longer about mirroring. It's about something more selective, more precise, more demanding. The question that remains is direct and unsettling. What happens when someone who has always been open decides, for the first time, to choose who can walk through the door? There is a point at which the empath realizes something disconcerting. It's not that he shut himself off from the world. It's that the world was never ready for someone who makes conscious choices. Jung observed that, after the initial mirroring, the psyche needs to learn an even more delicate skill: selection. Not out of moral judgment, but out of psychic economy. Energy is not infinite. Attention is not neutral. Relationships are not all the same. Until then, the empath functioned like a house without doors. Any emotion entered. Any demand was accepted. Any crisis became a priority. This seemed like a virtue, but Jung saw it as a lack of differentiation. When everything is welcomed, nothing is integrated. When everyone enters, the self disappears. The shift happens in a simple yet radical way. The empath begins to realize that some conversations make them clearer, while others confuse them. Some people broaden their awareness, others drain it. Before, they ignored this signal. Now they begin to respect it, not out of selfishness, but for psychic survival. A common example appears in everyday life, an old friendship based on long conversations about problems that never get resolved. The empath has always been there, listening, advising, supporting. One day he decides not to engage in the conversation in the same way. He listens less. He asks more. He doesn't offer ready-made solutions. The result is unexpected. The other person gets irritated. They say he's distant, that he's changed, that he doesn't care anymore. And it's at that moment that something becomes clear. The relationship depended on unilateral delivery. Jung described this as the collapse of the symbiotic bond. When the empath stops providing free emotional regulation, the relationship needs to reorganize itself, or it ends. There is no middle ground. Modern studies reinforce this observation. Research in relational psychology shows that bonds based on emotional dependence tend to intensify when the regulator withdraws, not because there is love, but because there is a loss of control. Another little-known fact: about 70% of people who describe themselves as highly empathetic report high levels of emotional exhaustion in close relationships. The number drops drastically when clear boundaries are established, not because empathy decreases, but because she becomes selective. And this is where many get confused. They think that the healed empath has lost sensitivity. In fact, they have refined their access. Jung insisted that individuation is not hardening, it is precision. The empath continues to feel deeply, but now chooses where to invest it. This changes everything. At work, he stops taking on conflicts that aren't his. In the family, he stops being the automatic mediator. In relationships, he quickly notices when the exchange is unequal. It doesn't take months. Sometimes just a few interactions are enough, not out of distrust, but out of pattern recognition. There's a recurring story in the clinical reports Jung analyzed. An empathic patient reported that, after establishing clear boundaries, half the people around him simply disappeared. He thought he was wrong. Then he realized something unsettling. These people never interacted with him personally, but rather with the role he played. This realization is painful because it forces the empath to confront a specific kind of grief, the grief for the version of themselves that was necessary to be accepted. Jung said that this grief is inevitable. Without it, individuation is not complete, but something surprising happens at the same time. While some distance themselves, others draw closer. People who respect boundaries, who don't demand constant explanations, who don't turn vulnerability into a bargaining chip. These relationships are less intense in their drama, but deeper in their presence. The empath begins to notice that they no longer need to explain themselves so much. They don't need to justify every absence. They don't need to prove that they care. Selective empathy creates a field of calm that didn't exist before. The nervous system responds, the body relaxes, sleep improves, the mind becomes clearer. Here's an unexpected fact. Studies on chronic stress show that continuous exposure to other people's emotional conflicts significantly increases cortisol levels. When this exposure decreases, the body enters a recovery state. In other words, setting boundaries is not just psychological, it's physiological. Jung understood this intuitively. For him, the self only emerges when a person stops fragmenting themselves for the sake of others. The empath, in selecting, is not rejecting the world. They are organizing their own psyche. But this phase still brings tension, because choosing implies saying no, and saying no triggers reactions. Some people try to negotiate, others blame, others dramatize. The empath feels the old urge to give in, but something has changed. They have already experienced clarity, and they don't want to return to chaos. It is at this point that empathy ceases to be an automatic reflex and becomes a conscious act. The empath no longer reacts out of habit. They decide, and each decision strengthens their inner axis. Jung viewed this phase as the construction of the psychic threshold, a clear point between what belongs to you and what belongs to the other. Without this threshold, there is no individuation. With it, something new emerges, silent self-respect. But this selection is still only the beginning, because recognizing patterns and choosing relationships is one thing. Using this perception strategically is another, and that's exactly what starts to take shape next. The question that remains unanswered is simple, yet unsettling. What happens when someone who has learned to select games starts to understand the entire game before it even begins? There is a phase of transformation that Jung treated with extreme care, because it carries a power that can corrupt or liberate. It is the moment when the empath realizes that they not only feel and select, Jung anticipates. He begins to see the movement before the gesture, the intention before the word, the outcome before the conflict. And this doesn't happen by magic. It happens as a consequence. For years, the empath lived in a state of alert. They needed to read their surroundings to protect themselves. They needed to detect minute changes to avoid outbursts, rejections, or losses. Their nervous system was trained to detect patterns. What was once survival now reveals itself as a vast and precise psychological database. Jung observed that when this unconscious material becomes conscious, something changes radically. The person stops reacting and begins to understand the whole dynamic. She doesn't just see isolated behavior, she sees the sequence. She recognizes the beginning, middle, and end of a human pattern with just a few clues. In everyday life, this manifests itself in an almost disconcerting way. A conversation begins, and within seconds, the empath already knows where it's going to end, not because they imagine it, but because they've lived that scenario dozens of times. The tone of voice, the rhythm of speech, the way the person avoids certain questions, everything points to the same outcome. Previously, this perception was accompanied by guilt. Am I being unfair? Am I exaggerating? Now it's not. The perception doesn't come loaded with emotion. It comes clean, it comes stable. It comes with a quiet certainty that doesn't need external confirmation. This is where Jung introduces a disturbing concept: differentiated perception. It's not just about feeling more than others. It's about processing psychic information at a level most people never access. The integrated empath not only picks up on emotions, they understand the mechanisms behind them. This creates a delicate situation, because at this point, the empath realizes something disturbing. They could manipulate with extreme ease. They know where to touch, what to say, when to distance themselves to create dependence, when to get closer to build trust. They understand human wounds because they have felt them firsthand. Jung did not romanticize this stage. He warned, "Here lies the true moral test," because power without conscience transforms, and conscience without ethics destroys. The integrated empath feels this tension internally. He perceives the psychological advantage he possesses in social interactions. He realizes he could win arguments before they even begin, that he could lead people without them realizing it. And for the first time, he understands something profound about himself. He doesn't want that. This refusal doesn't stem from weakness, but from the integration of the shadow. Jung said that only those who know their capacity to hurt are truly ethical. Those who have never integrated their own shadow are not good. They are merely limited. The integrated empath knows their capacity, and precisely for that reason, they choose not to use it to dominate. This creates a silent shift in how he relates to the world. He doesn't engage in power games. He doesn't dispute narratives. He doesn't try to convince. He observes and decides. Often he decides not to participate. This attitude is unsettling. People accustomed to control feel that something is slipping away. They try to provoke reactions, intensify emotions, create conflict, but nothing works. The empath has already seen the entire game before the first move and has chosen not to sit at the table. Jung described this state as psychic autonomy. The person no longer depends on external validation to trust their own judgment. They don't need to prove they are right. They simply act according to what you see. This is reflected in quick and seemingly cold, yet profoundly coherent decisions. The empath exits relationships before they become destructive. They refuse proposals they would have previously accepted out of guilt. They perceive hidden intentions without needing evidence accumulated over time. And something curious happens. The less he tries to control, the more control he has over his own life. Because true power lies not in influencing others, but in not being influenced by unconscious dynamics. Jung saw this as a clear sign of advanced individuation. The empath ceases to be governed by external complexes. He moves from the self, and this creates a presence that is difficult to define but easy to feel. People feel that they cannot manipulate him, that they cannot confuse him, that they cannot extract from him something that he does not want to give. This stage brings a strange peace. It's not euphoria, it's inner silence. The mind no longer races trying to understand the behavior of others. It already understands, and therefore, it doesn't get stuck. But this clarity hasn't completed the process. Because seeing everything and choosing not to manipulate isn't the end. Something essential is missing: the impact of this transformation on surrounding systems. When someone stops reacting, supporting, and unconsciously participating, entire structures begin to tremble. Relationships, families, work environments, everything that relied on the old version of the empath becomes unbalanced. And that's exactly what starts to happen next. When Jung spoke of the final stage of individuation, he was not describing a state of constant happiness. He was describing wholeness, a point where a person stops fighting against who they are, stops fragmenting themselves to fit in, and finally takes responsibility for themselves. This is where the healed empath becomes something rare, someone who feels deeply but doesn't lose themselves, someone who loves but doesn't erase themselves, someone who sees and doesn't pretend not to see. At this stage, something silent happens around you. Systems begin to crumble. Relationships that depended on your self-effacement fall into crisis. Families that functioned because you absorbed the tension become unstable. Environments that used your presence as an emotional buffer become chaotic. Not because you attacked, but because stopped supporting. Jung explained that every unconscious system needs a bearer. When this bearer awakens, the system either collapses or reorganizes itself. This is why, upon healing, the empath comes to be seen as selfish, cold or difficult, not because their character has changed, but because they have removed the energy that kept the imbalance functioning. Some people evolve. They look at their limitations and realize their own emptiness. They begin to do the inner work they have always avoided. Others resist. They victimize themselves. They try to blame you for the change. Jung observed that this is inevitable. Consciousness always forces a choice, to grow or to attack. A healed empath no longer argues. They don't over-explain. They don't try to save those who don't want to be saved. They observe the reactions and understand everything they need to know. And then they decide. Not with anger, not with revenge, with clarity. This is the point where sensitivity ceases to be a burden and becomes a guiding principle. And here's where something essential comes in. This doesn't happen on its own. Integration requires conscious action. That is why Jung argued that every profound psychic transformation needs to be translated into daily practice. Without practice, consciousness regresses. So, if you want to internalize what has been said here, start with something simple and straightforward. First, practice pausing. Before responding to any emotional demand, create inner silence. Ask yourself, is this mine? If it's not, don't absorb it. Observe. Return it neutrally. This pause changes everything. Second, map your patterns. Observe which relationships drain you and which strengthen you, not with judgment, but with honesty. Mentally note how you feel after each interaction. The body doesn't lie. Third, establish clear boundaries even if they are uncomfortable. Don't over-explain. Boundaries are not arguments, they are decisions. Jung said that every time you over-explain, you are asking permission to exist. Fourth, accept the grief. Some people will leave your life, not because you failed, but because the relationship depended on your unconsciousness. Feeling sadness here is natural. Going back out of guilt is repeating the cycle. Fifth, direct your empathy. Invest in people who take emotional responsibility. Take energy away from those who only consume it. Empathy without discernment becomes self-neglect. Empathy with awareness becomes strength. Sixth, trust what you perceive. If something doesn't add up, don't force it. Jung stated that integrated intuition doesn't shout, it whispers. Learn to listen before it turns into pain. When you apply this, something changes. The drama diminishes, the confusion dissolves. You begin to feel more centered, more present, more whole. Not because the world has become better, but because you stopped getting lost in it. And then comes the final understanding, the one Jung considered liberating. You did not come into the world to carry the unconscious of others. You came to realize your own self, and in doing so, you become a living example that it is possible to feel deeply without destroying yourself. A healed empath is not someone who has become hardened. It is someone who has learned to respect themselves. They become love with a backbone, compassion with limits, sensitivity with direction, and that is one of the rarest forms of psychological maturity. If you've made it this far, you might recognize parts of yourself in this journey. Perhaps you realize that your breaking point was, in fact, your conscious birth. If so, know that you are not alone. This process is difficult, but it's real, and it's transformative. If this content resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps this type of material reach more people who need to hear it right now. If you'd like, leave a comment sharing your experience or questions. You can do this anonymously if you prefer. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to begin their journey to freedom. Here, we talk about awareness, psychological depth, and real transformation. If you feel too much, see too much, and are learning to choose yourself, this space is for you.